Hi, this is Ben Kutchins. I'm the director of photography for Ozark, and you're listening to the Go Creative Show.
Hey everyone, my name is Ben Consoli. I am a director and owner of BC Media Productions. And this is the Go Creative Show, a podcast for filmmakers. So on today's show, we talk all about Ozark, Season 3. We've got the director of photography, Ben Kutchins, on. And we're going to talk a lot about, first of all, that delicious, creamy, bluish, dark look of Ozark. You know, anytime you see a still frame from Ozark, you know it's Ozark. It has such a distinctive look. How does he achieve it? He's going to tell us all about it. His color grade choices, his exposure, it's all there. But we also talk about his lighting decisions, like he's now using Astera tubes on the show, which are these great LED, very portable, lightweight, battery-powered LED tubes that you can control with an iPad. We talk all about those. And also his decision to switch from the Panasonic VariCam to the Sony Venice. Why? Why did he do it? Now we're going to know. And you guys would love to find out the reasons for it and what that switch, how he had to change up other things too. His lighting, his exposure, his lenses. A lot of stuff changes when you change your camera package. And we talk all about it. I want to encourage you to do a couple of things. One, subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app so that you'd never miss an episode. And follow us on social media. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. We give you an opportunity to have your questions heard on the show. And wow, we have a lot of questions from the audience on this episode. But for now, let's get right to it because there's so much to discuss with Ben Kutchins, the director of photography for Ozark. So I'm here with Ben Kutchins, cinematographer of Ozark Season 3, all of them really, but we're here for Season 3, which is just so good. I haven't yet finished it, but my producer did just today, and he's like, oh my God, you've got to catch up. It's phenomenal. Congratulations on such a great success.
Thanks so much, man. I really appreciate it. It's been a fun show to be a part of, and I the last 2 years I've been sharing it with a DP named Armando Salas, who's super talented, and he brought a lot to the table too. I mean, this year, Season 3, I didn't shoot the majority of the episodes, but I shot the opening with Jason Bateman directing, and I shot episode 6 with Ben Seminoff directing. This year was a little complicated in terms of how the scheduling worked out.
Why is that?
But I left to go do a movie. And Armando came into, Armando shared the last season with me, and then this season it just got complicated. Well, because essentially when it came down to it, one person directed the last 4 episodes. So 7 through 10 is directed by one director, Alex Sakharov, who's shot some of Game of Thrones and directed some Game of Thrones and is a fantastic director. So he came in and he did all 4 of the last episodes. And they shot all of those as a block, as one big movie almost. And so that necessitated it being one cinematographer for the end. And that wasn't necessarily the plan from the beginning. So, but that's the way the cookie crumbled and it worked out that way. And Armando did that sort of monster block is what they were calling it. And did such a great job, man. He's so talented and I'm so lucky to be in his company.
So we're in Season 3 now. You've been involved in all of them.
Yes.
How has the show evolved visually across the 3 seasons?
It's interesting. So this year we made a big change, which is we switched format. We went to a larger format camera. We went to the Sony Venice and so some big technological changes sort of a big step up for us. And that's been a lot of fun to sort of like, okay, well, how do we continue the show, but then use all of these new tools to help tell the story? So that was something that was really fun to get into this year.
What were you shooting the first 2 seasons on? I don't remember.
So the first 2 seasons were shot on the Panasonic VariCam, which is, Panasonic's sort of competition with the Red and Alexa and all these cameras. It's a Super 35 sensor, and it's a great camera for low light. It's not my favorite camera, but it's a great camera for shooting in low light. It really has a grittiness to it in low light that I think really served us for the first 2 seasons. It was sort of the funkiest look. of all of the cameras that we tested. We tested a bunch of cameras, and that was sort of the one that had the most grit to it. When we sort of put it through all the paces of low light, and so it served us well for 2 years. And then, once there was an option to go to a bigger, Netflix has a 4K requirement, right? So that whatever you turn in has to be 4K. So that sort of limited your options a few years ago.
Yeah.
Even last year. Now you can shoot on the Alexa LF, a bigger, full frame sensor camera, or you can shoot on the Sony Venice, or you can shoot on the Red. You can shoot on a Canon. There's some different cameras out there that are competitive, but really, and from my perspective, I'm not a Red person. So from where I'm sitting, the Alexa LF and the Sony Venice are the two cameras that we tested this year when we decided to make the jump.
What was it about the Venice that made you say, this is the camera? Because so many people are using those Alexas and now the LFs, and I love the look of the Venice. I'm a Sony guy, as people in the audience know, but I don't hear as many people using that camera as the Alexas, and more as we go. But I'm always curious what the ultimate decision was when you're down to those two.
So there's a couple things. One is when we started out, when we were doing the testing and when we started the season, there weren't really very many mini LF, Alexa mini LF. So that's the smaller version of the LF camera.
Yeah.
And we tend to move fast. It's a TV show. And so that wasn't a possibility. The Sony Venice is actually significantly lighter in weight than the LF. For a full frame camera, it's significantly lighter than the full size LF. Now, once you have the Alexa mini LF, it's actually a perfectly sized camera. I mean, it's tiny. It's like this. It's about the size of a Red. I would say it's comparable size and weight of a Red, and it's a fantastic camera. But that wasn't available to us when we started the season. So we did some tests, and ultimately, we were able to get the cameras to look very similar. I think once you're dealing with these sort of, bigger companies now, Sony, Arri, Red, all of these sensors are pretty similar. I'm not a super expert, but the reality is that there's the quality of all the sensors is very similar. Now, what differs between the different cameras is how they, debayer or translate that information to an image post capture. That's where really each company's sort of special sauce comes in. And Arri Alexa sauce is slightly different than the Sony Venice sauce. And, but the sensors are all very high quality sensors. They're so competitive. I mean, it's a great time to be a cinematographer, man. Let me tell you, the abundance of riches that we have in terms of the tools that we get to play with. I'm hard pressed to sit here and tell you that you can't make a beautiful movie with a Sony Venice or an Alexa or a Red. Some people work really well with the Red. Eric Messerschmidt, who's been shooting, Mindhunter for Fincher. Fincher's a Red guy, and they know how to make that camera look incredible. So it's really about the sauce and what you're doing in post-production and who your colorist is and what, there's so many variables that come into play. Ultimately for us, so there's a version of the Sony that's called the Rialto, where essentially you're attaching a sensor to a body separately, which makes it even smaller than a mini. So for us, that was a tool that we used a lot, essentially creating a smaller camera. And I'll be honest and say, if the Arri Alexa Mini LF was out at that time, we might have gone with that camera. They were so close. They were so close.
What is that Rialto thing? Is that a different camera or? So
essentially the Rialto is a sensor that doesn't have any of the guts of the camera attached to it. It's just a little box that essentially has a sensor inside of it. Now you have to attach that little sensor box to a camera body. You have to have a full size Sony Venice camera body to attach it to.
It's the same sensor as the Sony Venice, but just broken out for, so that you can have I can't think of the word, but the way Red does it, where you kind of build your camera.
Exactly. I mean, except that the sensor box for the Rialto is essentially the size of maybe 3 iPhones stacked together. It's tiny. I mean, because it's just a sensor and a lens mount. And then all of the information travels back to your full-size camera body. It's a great tool. I mean, I can try to send you a couple of pictures of it in action. I mean, you can tuck it in a corner. You can put it against a wall. You can sort of get it flush to a wall in a way that you can't with a big camera body. You can use it handheld to move in ways that's simply not possible with a full-size camera. I mean, you can hand hold it in one hand if you wanted to. So it's a great tool. Let's
talk about the look. Now that I know you're using the Venice, so different camera package, inherently there's going to be some differences visually regardless. Tell me about the look of this season. We're now using large format. What does that allow you to do that you weren't able to do before?
So it allows us to do a lot of things. First and foremost, it allows us to shoot a little higher ASA when needed. Like if we're a little low on light, there's a 5,000 base setting on the Sony Venice, which is actually pretty incredible.
Yeah.
Now, so what I do is I set it at a 5,000 base, and then I drop it down to 1,600 ASA. So you're essentially using this new sort of baseline, but reducing the grain a little bit, so you're not shooting at this extremely high grainy image. I mean, I have to say the 5,000 ASA looks pretty good.
Yeah, I was going to say if that's its base, why is it grainy?
Well, because 5,000 ASA, is grainy inherently and just has less color depth. But as it's interesting. You're sort of tricking the sensor back into a place where it's a little less grainy and the color definition is a little better by putting it at 5,000 base and then bringing it down to 1,600. You're regaining a little bit of that, a little less noise, and you're regaining a little bit of that color depth.
So is the strategy, I guess, is the thought that it starts at a higher ISO than you would normally do, so that you have to kind of pull back to get to where you would more normally be, thus like having a deeper, richer black? Is that kind of, am I understanding it right?
You are. That's exactly what it is. A little more detail, in shadows and highlights, sort of bringing it back into a realm. Because essentially the Sony Venice is really like a 500 ASA sensor. So once you start pushing it up into the 1,600 or 3,200 range of the ISO, you're really straining that sensor to its limit, because it's not really meant to shoot up there. It works, and it's actually a great look if that's what you're going for. It certainly creates a distinct look. And some people do that. Some people push the ISOs really high and add a bunch of ND in front of the lens because they like the way that looks. I think I prefer to shoot as close to the base setting as possible when you're shooting at that, 500 or 800. I'm happy to push it up a little bit and open it a little bit, but I don't like to push it too far, because you do lose some color depth and you start getting a little grainy, especially on a show I like to light really low light. And I like to be able to feel like I'm going to be able to raise the, if the face is a little too dark in the mix, then I want to be able to grab that face and do a power window later and bring it up without it getting super grainy. So it's always riding this like razor's edge of exposure on a show that's so dark to begin with. And just to clarify, like, I'm not shooting Ozark at a normal exposure and then bringing it down later. So that's why sometimes I'm playing with the 5,000 and bringing it down to 1,600, so that I'm really like riding that razor's edge of like knowing how much I can bring it up without it getting super grainy. When you put a power window on somebody's face and brighten it up, you're increasing the grain in it. So if there isn't enough exposure there to begin with, it's going to get super noisy really quick. It's going to get soft and fuzzy and grainy. And that's not something that's a good look. You want to make sure you have just enough exposure to be able to raise the highlights on that face, the mids and the highlights on that face, to be able to pop it out a little bit.
So you're trying to avoid having to do heavy power windows on the faces so that you don't get that grain, because you're lighting and shooting pretty dark.
No, I mean, to clarify, I am using power windows, and I'm planning on doing it. What I'm trying to protect myself is that when I do that I won't end up with a muddy face when I try to brighten it up.
That makes sense.
I'm riding it right at the edge. So there's just enough exposure there, knowing I'm going to make that highlight a little brighter. Because the problem is when you make that highlight side brighter, Ozark is a very dark show. And when you turn that light up and you make that face brighter on set, you're also lighting up the set. Like, there's no amount of flags in the world that won't keep it from bouncing around all over the place. So once you turn that light a little brighter, you're gonna light the set a little bit more. And I really like to keep the sets dark on Ozark. I really like to just be able to see the little outline of somebody's face, against a dark background. That's how I have fun on Ozark.
We've noticed. And we love it. When you watch these people walk through their house and you're like, Jesus, just put a light on, for Christ's sakes. Like, they never want to have any illumination whatsoever.
It is ridiculous, but it's also interesting. There's something I shot with Jason directing this year, and it's early on, and I'll try not to drop too many spoilers or anything, but like,
the show's been out long enough. You can expect people to have watched it. So too bad if you get spoiled.
So anyway, there's a scene where Jason's living in the hotel, and Marty Bird is living in the hotel, and he starts to feel like he's being followed. There's an SUV following him. He's in a parking lot, and he calls Helen, and they make the decision that he should go home and he should hide out at the house. And he goes home, and he's trying to figure out where he's going to sleep. They turn off all the lights in the house, and he's trying to figure out where he can sleep, and all the lights are off in the house. And she says, Wendy Bird says to Marty Bird, like, we live in a fishbowl. Like, you're going to sleep by the window.
Yeah.
She's trying to convince him, like, just come sleep in the bedroom. Like, cause they're fighting, they're in this big battle. And she's like, we live in a fishbowl. You can't sleep there. And that's sort of part of the conceit, is like, these people don't want to turn on the lights. They don't want people to be able to like pull up on a boat in the lake and be able to see them. And, it's a dark show for a reason. These are people that are hiding out. They're doing their best to hide out. There's fear lurks around every corner, man. and I have, we have fun playing with it. And, I think you got to make bold moves in this day and age, and have fun and be playful and be creative. And I'm glad that people are responding to it.
People certainly are. I mean, we got a lot of response from just our, on social media, people asking tons of questions. And we'll get to a bunch of them for sure. I want to talk about your locations, because the house has remained consistent across all 3 seasons, which is just such a unique, just architecturally, it's a really unique house. And like you said, there's glass everywhere. So I can only imagine the challenges you have to face there. But you've also introduced a whole bunch of new locations this time around. So you have the Bird Enterprises, not new, but newer. You have the casino, both casinos. And you have the that cell that he's in, like the drug lord's house, and then also the cell underground. So you're playing with a lot of new locations this time around. Talk to me a little bit about how you strategize lighting and shooting a location so that you certainly you're paying a tribute to the fact that it's new and there has to be something new about it, but also keeping it consistent with the rest of the look of the show.
Yeah, that was a really interesting challenge. I'll start with the casino, their casino that they opened, the Mississippi Belle, or the Missouri Belle, sorry. And that was a big lighting job. And I'll say that, we didn't have much lead time on that set, and that set was built, that was the plans for that were approved very last minute, and the lighting for it was all going up, like super fast. And so that was, our production designer, David Bomba, this year designed that and built that. And really, like, what we wanted to do was to build a set that lit itself, because it's a casino and there's lights everywhere, and that's sort of the conceit, is that, a casino shouldn't be dark and dim because you want to keep people awake. You want to keep people gambling. You don't want them to feel like it's even if it's the middle of the night, you don't want to feel like it's the middle of the night. So that, for Ozark, which was a dark show, that was an interesting challenge to create something that A, lit itself, and B, wasn't just flat lit, the whole thing, but had enough light so that we could walk through there with a steady camera or crane and essentially be lit. So what David and I did was sort of strategize on all these different types of lamps that we could bring in. And I really wanted to have some pools of light. And so he came up with this idea of these sort of star lamps, and we put LEDs inside of those, and all of those are wired to a board. And, often as we're moving through the space, things are dimming up and down. That entire casino is sort of wired. So, that's sort of how we keep a little bit of a contrasty yet bright look, is that everything is wired. So as you're moving through the space, things are turning off behind the camera, because that light behind the camera is what's going to flatten things out as you move. But it has to be super subtle, So it was kind of, creating a dance, and David did such a great job, man. He's so talented and a beautiful human being. And he did such a fantastic job. And the other interesting thing about that is to make it believable that it's a boat. That set had to have really low ceilings, which if anyone who's listening, who's a cinematographer, you take them into a low ceiling set, man, they just start to cry, because you can't control light. Even if you put a light on the ground, it's bouncing off the ceiling because it's so close. You just can't control light. It makes our job so hard to have low ceilings. And for as big of a space that is, like, it was a big negotiation in terms of like how low those ceilings could be and have it be believable. So that was a big challenge. And also the other part of it is that, there was a lot of discussion as like, how do we keep it in the vein of the show? Because it's not going to be something that's going to be super coldly lit, right? It's like, and I think of casinos as inherently warm, and you want it to be kind of vibrant and colorful. And so it was a lot of back and forth in terms of how we arrived there and testing different paint colors. And, it was a lot of back and forth and conversations, and it just flowed between me and David, and Armando weighed in also. And, but it was a big job, and we did it really fast. And ultimately, like, what I decided to do was just let all those tungsten lights be tungsten. Cause there's, it's majority of it is lit by tungsten. And then I just made an adjustment to our shooting LUT that really took a lot of the sort of magenta out of the shooting LUT and took the sort of harsh warmth out of it, but allowed it to be a little more golden and a little more, subtly warm instead of this punchy red, which it sort of came up, if that footage was transmitted to your television as the sensor captured it, it would be jarringly different than the show. So we just sort of created an extreme LUT to deal with that interior.
Did you have real slot machines, or were you able to swap the lights out in them?
Yes. So we actually did some testing on some real slot machines, and most of them flickered.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. As I'm watching this show, I'm thinking to myself, what a nightmare this location is, because it has to feel congested. It has to have the low ceilings. Everything is top lit. I'm like, what? This sucks to have to film in this. and I think you guys did such a great job. You dealt with so many variables between the top lighting, the slot machine lighting, the size of it. I mean, it's crazy.
Well, thank you, man. It was not easy. I mean, all of those slot machines ended up getting rigged with LEDs. Some of them were existing lights that we just didn't have the time or the resources to do all of them.
Yeah.
But, we sort of isolated the slot machines that we could use that didn't flicker. We did use some that did have some lights that flickered, and those had to be, those lights that flickered had to be taken out and replaced with, LED strips. And this was all sort of coordinated by our gaffer, Edison Jackson, who's like such a talented guy, man. He's so and such a lovely human being. And they did such a great job. And it came together. It was literally coming together as we rolled the cameras in there to start shooting. So that was a tough one, but a lot of fun. And I'm glad it worked out. Yeah, it is sort of a nightmare location, and I didn't realize how big of a nightmare it was until I sort of started digging into it. And, man, I'm glad it worked out.
What was the first challenge that you faced doing that when you started shooting in there and you thought, oh my God, what did we get ourselves into? There must have been the one thing that set the whole thing off.
Well, it was, that it was so rushed that we were in there shooting and some of the stuff hadn't been programmed into the board. And, there was like a couple slot machines that had just started going crazy, like we'd be in mid shot and we would, something would just dim up and all of a sudden this, slot machine would just start glowing, 10 stops over the other ones, but with a great crew, man, and a little bit of patience, like everything came together. It was, I have to say, given the amount of time that we had to do it, it was seamless.
We got a question from Instagram. Carlitos on Instagram wants to know, how difficult were the shots taken on water?
Shooting on water is way harder than you could ever imagine. We didn't, we've sort of, if you haven't noticed, we have over the season steered more and more away from the water.
I have noticed.
In season 1, there was whole scenes and set pieces that took place on the water, and it just became sort of unfeasible for our schedule, because it's the amount of resources that it takes to get people, all the crew and everyone out there and safely, and safety is a big concern for us. It's not we don't want to just go out there and roll and hope it works out. It's like everything is coordinated, and so getting a shot boat to boat is really hard, and all these things are pretty tough, and so we're just more careful about how we not biting off more than we can chew on the water. But essentially, like usually when we're on the water, we have a 50-foot techno on a boat, or maybe it's a 30-foot techno on a boat. On basically like a high performance speedboat.
Yeah.
And with a, remote head on it. And that's sort of the only way to get shots that aren't wobbling all over the place and be able to maneuver and get close to another boat safely. There's a lot of stuff that we do out there that just wouldn't be safe to do if you didn't have a way to extend the camera out away from the platform that you're shooting on.
Yeah.
So it's not easy, and I wouldn't recommend it to anybody, to be completely honest.
So avoid water at all costs.
Well, yeah. I mean, also just water safety. Anytime that we're even close to the water, we have a whole marine unit that is responsible for our safety.
Is that normal?
Yes. I mean, it is. Wow. Because it's so dangerous. If you think about, you have electricity, you have people with heavy gear next to cameras. How do you keep people safe? How do you keep people from falling into the water and gear falling with them into the water that could drag them down? You have high speed boats, you have potential boat collisions, you have, so all of these things are very carefully coordinated, and it's sort of similar to doing car work, but then you have the added layer of people could drown, and if there's a collision, it's not as simple as a car collision. It's very serious, and we take it all very seriously.
One of the new locations is Omar Navarro's home, which is in Mexico. And you have to, this is a situation where you have to break the color. You can't have the same exact color in the Ozarks as you do in Mexico. So you have to have something different. How do you kind of blend the two together so it still feels cohesive, but you're somewhere else?
Well, my strategy was to really add some warmth and then desaturate, and then just choose some key colors to sort of let be saturated. And I'll say that I established Navarro's exterior, Navarro's mansion. I did some of in episodes 1 and 2, Jason and I filmed some scenes that take place at his mansion, but Armando Salas did the heavy lifting in terms of, that stuff that's in the
interiors
basement cellar.
Yeah.
That's all Armando, and he did such a great job. And it's interesting because him and I were discussing it, and he's like, I have this scene where it's like he's supposed to be tortured by turning on a bright light in his face, yet this is the darkest show on television. How do I make it seem bright without just burning out the sensor and making this kind of unwatchable and not feel like it's part of the show? So it was really interesting, man. And I hats off to him. He really did it. He did something special.
But what was the solution? Do you know?
I do. He essentially made he sort of used an anamorphic filter to create these, when these lights flash towards the lens, that they really flare out and create something that feels brighter than it actually is. You know, it sort of feels like what it might look like when you look at something and it's too bright and it sort of smears out. And I thought that was just a genius solution. And, you know, it's like, he's such an artist.
I wasn't even thinking about that, but you're so right. Like it breaks the look of the show to have that scene. But I guess it's okay, because that's the whole point, is that it's this, you know, it's supposed to be over the top. It's supposed to be torture. So it can be different. Okay. So just take a couple steps back. So to create this Mexico look, you were warming it up, but desaturating at the same time. Did I hear that right?
That's correct. So essentially what I did is I created a LUT, that a new LUT, you know, not using the show LUT, but something that added a lot of warmth to the highlights and kept sort of the shadows in that cooler vein, but a ton of warmth to the highlights. So most of that color is coming from the highlights. So again, that it still fit with the look of the show, yet had a very different feeling. And then by adding I added even more grain than I usually added and popped the highlights, added a little more contrast, but still it's, you know, it's dark, and I feel like it flows with the rest of the show, you know, but there's
absolutely
just something a little different, you know?
Yeah, it absolutely does. You know, you're somewhere different, but it still feels like Ozark, which is, I mean, a testament to the work that you guys were doing in those first couple episodes. We got a lot of questions about camera and lenses, so we might as well hit them here since we're talking about, you know, your lens choices and color options. So let's see. We have Ryan Postus on Instagram. Let's see. IMDb says you shot on Varicam previous seasons, but this one's Venice. Yes, we talked about that. Oh, so, okay. So he says also it seems like the show warmed up in color temperature this season. I guess the question here is that true? I mean, obviously we said yes for the Mexico stuff, but did you warm up your visuals at all for the stuff in the Ozarks?
I feel like, you know, it's interesting. There was not a conscious effort to make the show warmer, but if you look at, you know, sort of the locations and what the show was this season, I feel like it is naturally warmer. You have the casino that we talked about. There's the other casino. You know, there's sort of all these new locations. You have Mexico, and I feel like, you know, sort of our base look didn't change that much. I think ultimately, like, it's possible that it's slightly more desaturated than it was before. And, you know, because it's all new color science, you know, we basically had to create a new LUT from scratch that felt like our previous LUT because we had a new camera. We couldn't, you know, we weren't just plugging our old LUT into everything. You know, that it's entirely possible, but there was no conscious effort to make it warmer. I think that maybe the show is slightly desaturated, and I think that there potentially was a little bit more warmth in skin tone or warmth in highlights. I mean, that's something that I've been sort of playing with, you know, and I tend to like add a tiny bit of warmth to the highlights if things are feeling too punchy blue. I think that's a nice trick to sort of trick your eye into feeling like it, not feeling like everything is just sort of iced over. So yeah, potentially there wasn't a conscious effort to make it warmer this season, if that's sort of the question.
Yeah, it sounds like he just was inquiring about the color temperature, and we've got that answered, so I feel good about that. But thanks for the question, Ryan. Sharice Antonio's asking, have you changed the way you work, either in lighting, lenses, et cetera, now that you're shooting on Venice? So what has changed since you've made that jump?
Well, I feel like something has changed, but it's not necessarily because of the Venice. Potentially it is a little bit because of the Venice. You don't need quite as much light when you're using, for me personally, I wouldn't recommend this to everybody, but for me personally, using a slightly bigger sensor, I feel more comfortable diving into underexposure. So I was using maybe even a tiny bit less light this season, and mostly so, and part of that change was using more what's called an Astera tube,
Yeah.
So an Astera tube is essentially like a Kino size fluorescent tube, but it's actually an LED and it's fully dimmable. And
RGB too, right?
RGB control, RGB controllable and very sensitive, and the green and the magenta shift and the yellow and blue. I mean, it's a super sensitive tool. You can punch in, half a degree. I mean, it's so sensitive and it's beautiful because they're fully battery. They're essentially like what's the right word for it? They're a standalone. They're battery operated. You can tape one to the ceiling, and it's its own thing. You don't need to plug it in. You can Velcro it into a corner, and you don't need to run a wire to it. So that was sort of my go-to light a lot, simply for the speed of it, but also you take it and you diffuse it a little bit and you put a grid on it so that it's not spilling everywhere. And actually our crew is amazing. I mean, there are grids available, but to be honest, they're not very good. So our grip crew built a bunch of honeycomb grids for those lights and boxes for them to go in. And
wow,
we sort of built our own housings for the light. And that just means I can take something and I can stick it up and I can have a soft, subtle source that's fully dimmable and color controllable from a ceiling or a corner, and I can have it in 3 minutes. You know what I mean? 3 minutes or less, you can tuck a light somewhere and hide. You can hide a light almost anywhere. It's incredible, and it's my new favorite tool in filmmaking. And our cameras are so sensitive now, and especially with those bigger sensors, you can just get away with so much. It's really, again, it's a good time to be a cinematographer.
What I love about the Astera tubes also, because I've used them a bunch, is that they look great at really low dim. A lot of the LEDs, you get down to 10, 8, they start to just sort of, they're iffy. These are pretty solid all the way through the spectrum, I found. Did you find that as well, that you can dim pretty low and still get a consistency from it?
Oh, yeah. I would say that 90% of the time, those things are operating at, between 5 and 15%.
Yeah.
I mean, they're so bright. You turn one of those things on at 100% and it's man, you need to put in an ND in front of the lens. It's those things are super powerful. So yeah, most of the time operating all the way at the bottom. And like you said, they're great. Occasionally they get a little glitchy if you're trying to turn them off. I mean, a lot of what I'll do, especially on a show like Ozark is as the shot moves, I'm dimming things up and down as people move through space and the camera moves through space. I'm actually manipulating the light to be the ideal for each sort of step in the blocking.
Yeah.
So I'll sort of with the gaffer coordinate okay, when Jason crosses the room from his first mark to his second mark, dim that from 25% to 15%, so that the light sort of molds with the action. And so I have to say they perform really well, and we definitely put them through their paces. The only issue is sometimes if you're trying to turn them all the way off, but there's a simple solution to that, which is you just wrap it in ND. You put ND9 on it. You operate it at 75%. You bring it down to 10%. 10% is essentially almost off with an ND9 on there. So where there's a will, there's a way. It's if you have a bulb that's being finicky and doesn't want to turn all the way off without popping off, it won't be subtle at the bottom end of the curve. You can just put ND on it and it'll behave.
You said you did episode 1, 2, and 6, right?
That's correct.
Was 6 the one where you had just referenced it, where they had to shut all the lights off in the house because they're being followed? Was that 6?
I don't know if that's 6. No, I think that's earlier. I think. Oh, is that 6? Oh, I'm sorry.
Well,
yes,
you did that
6.
one, right? You did the one
that
where
is 6. Yes,
okay.
yes.
Well,
sorry, I lose track.
I can imagine.
It's all a big Ozark blur.
I can imagine. Well, there's something I noticed in that episode, and that's as far as I've gone. So I haven't seen the last 4, but there's something I noticed in that episode that I thought was really interesting, is your use of camera movement. I thought that one episode in particular seems like there was a really heavy focus on blocking, camera movement, because there was a ton of these long oneers where you would do a slow push in or a slow pull out. And there was a lot of action where, throughout the whole shot, it seemed like there were 3 or 4 shots in there, but it was really just one because the blocking was so clever. And I noticed it more in that episode than the previous 5, and wondering, First of all, am I just seeing things, or was that something that came from the director?
100%. So that episode is actually directed by our camera operator, Ben Seminoff, who's like one of the best in the business.
Look at that.
He's so talented. He's such a good storyteller. So you're not wrong, buddy. you're 100% right. And I mean, but really, like, that is sort of the ethos of the show. And Ben really like took it and ran with it, you know, and I'm always down. I'm the one that's always pushing everybody, like, hey, let's do this in a oneer. Let's make this work in a oneer. And it's all about making that shot engaging from top to bottom. Because if you keep it engaging, then nobody's going to, there's not going to be a lull while you're waiting for the blocking to resolve itself. You know, so it's all about, you know, that sort of careful dance of the characters and the camera, and not making it self-conscious, because it's really easy to block something that's exciting from top to bottom. But if people are like dancing around, like, that's just not natural. Human beings don't move like that. You know, we move in weird ways, and it doesn't always make sense. And so, you know, that dance is something that Ben Seminoff understands, and I really like try to understand and try to master. How do we keep a shot alive? You know, how do you stay alive? How do you see the other person's face? If you want to see that reaction, how can you get that reaction? If you're pushing into an over the shoulder, how can you change the blocking at that moment in a natural way so that you can see the person's reaction and see both people? You know, does that turn into a 2-shot? Does the person turn away just enough so you can see their face? And if that camera keeps moving around and wrapping around, then maybe you just get enough of the glimpse of the eye that you see that character's reaction. You know, that's sort of the stuff that Ben and I just like stay up late at night thinking about, to be honest. Like, we're total nerds, and we feed off each other. I mean, it's been, you know, the last couple seasons, him and I have just had so much fun, man. We have so much fun together.
And when it's executed well, like it has been on Ozark, you really don't realize you've just watched a oneer. It like tricks you almost. You get to the end of the scene, you're like, holy shit, that was one shot. Like, how did that happen? Because so much is going on in the frame. And you brought something else up that is really interesting, because you're right. It's like the movement of the characters has to be natural, or it'll feel almost like a musical or something, where people are just, you know, dancing around in an odd way and purposefully getting out of people's way. This felt like where everyone moved, it was supposed to be there. And I know I'm not describing this well, but anyone that sees the episode will know what I'm talking about. But there is a scene in The Office, Bird Enterprises, where I can't remember that woman's name, but the one that has the baby, the older woman that is having an affair with, okay, so.
Darlene.
Darlene, yes. So there's a shot in there where Darlene enters the office and lands just in a perfect spot between like 2 or 3 columns in the office. Are you remembering the scene I'm talking about? How she enters that scene?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I remember.
I have to know, how many takes did that take to get her to land exactly in that spot at that exact moment? I can't even imagine.
I mean, I got to say, actually, it didn't take that many takes to get it. What takes the time is to set up the blocking so that it really works and makes sense. You know what I mean? And that it feels natural. And the beauty of it is that we have these amazing actors. You know, you have Laura Linney and Bateman and Julia Garner and so many talented actors. And it's really like a testament to their openness and vulnerability that we have very open discussions with them. We don't block scenes and then bring people in and tell them to hit the mark. It's like, you know, we do the scene and we talk about it, and we're open and honest about like what works for the camera, and we're descriptive and communicate clearly with the actors. You know, I think that there's a lot of sense of like, you know, don't talk to the actors and, you know, don't bother them and you're going to ruin their process. And it's like, man, you know, I think the really good actors that I have worked with, they want to know, they want to make sure that it's working for the camera. And I have to say, like, our whole cast on Ozark is super aware and respectful. You know, there's no sort of talking down to us and we're just a crew. I mean, it is really like a family environment, from the production assistants to Jason Bateman and Laura Linney. Like everyone is treated with respect and kindness. And that level of communication is what makes that possible. If you don't have that sort of open communication and you're not willing to step up and say, hey, you know what, that doesn't really work for the camera. I'm trying to understand, like, how could we make this accessible? What's something that works for you, that works for like what works best for all of us, because and the actors are gracious enough to understand that, like, what works best for all of us is best for the show, so it's a beautiful, dance, and it's also great to have actors around who are like, hey, I don't think I would do that in this scene, in this moment. I wouldn't turn away, I'm like, okay, cool. Like, we'll figure it out. Like, that's the moment where, like, we have to turn our wheels and tear our hair out and figure it out quick,
Yeah. I want to get through a couple of audience questions as we wrap up here in our last few minutes. Ryan Dean DP on Instagram. He says, what did the average daytime exterior setup look like? Almost every scene outdoors looks like it was shot at the same time of day. I don't know how rigorous a TV schedule can be, but how did you pull that off? And then he asked, did you purposefully put your talent in the shade, shoot wide open? What were your techniques? So just general questions about shooting exteriors and keeping them consistent.
I mean, I would just say all of that. Yes.
Yeah.
My answer is just yes to all of that. So
elaborate, please.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I will. So, a typical day on exterior on Ozark, if we're in the midday sun or whatever, is covered. We're attempting to shoot everything in shade. From the beginning of the season, it's like, unless the light is really low in the sky, sort of streaming across and backlighting, there's no direct light on people. So that's an intense amount of planning and work. Like, so, as we're building the schedule, I have to know what scene we're going to be shooting at what time of day, and I have to plan accordingly. And I have to pivot, and I have to, make a negotiation with the assistant director and the director in terms of how we're scheduling scenes and what we're going to shoot first and what we're going to shoot second and what we're going to shoot sixth. And within that plan, I have a plan of where the condors are going to go. So I would say a typical day exterior on Ozark is a minimum of a 20 by to cover, so that's 20 feet by 20 feet on a condor or some kind of lift. Often if it's a space that can accommodate it, it's a 40 by 40. And I tend to been using either a gray grid to block light, or I'll use a full grid with a double net on the bottom of it, so that there's still some light coming through, right? So that a black often feels too dark. If it's going to be close to the actors at all, you don't necessarily want to use a black because you'll start to feel it. But if you use something that blocks the direct and then something that on top of that blocks the reflectivity. So if you put up a big 20 by 20, you've basically put up a bounce now. The light hitting that is going to bounce off of it. So then I'll put a net underneath it to kill that bounce quality of it. So you're essentially blocking the direct, and you're blocking a lot of the ambience that's coming through. And with that net, you're sort of taking a little bit of the sheen off of it, but there's still just enough light coming through that it's not a solid negative source. So it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to cover people. It's a little bit of insanity. I can send you a photo of a couple setups. I don't tend to document my work, so everything I send you is like taken by the assistants who are laughing at me, essentially. They just have to take a photo for posterity to send me later and say, hey, how much did this day suck? But it's cool. It's a puzzle, and that's why pre-production is so important, and to use that time wisely and really be looking out for yourself. And Jason Bateman is a fantastic director, but he expects you to show up and be prepared. If you're shooting a scene at this time of day, you should have all of the plans in place so that you can work. That can work. And if it's not going to work at that time, he's happy to accommodate you and shoot it at a different time. But you have to know, where is the sun going to be? How am I planning on blocking it? Where is the base of that condor going to go and be hidden so that it's not in shot? Those are all like tough things to do on a schedule where you're shooting 6 scenes a day, 6 pages a day. It's not easy. And it's a testament to our amazing crew that it gets done.
And lastly, we've got Jaden Marvel on Twitter wanting to know what your favorite lenses are. I'm curious what your favorites are. I think I'm more curious what it is that you used on Ozark. So hopefully they're one and the same. We'll see.
So this year on Ozark, we switched camera format, but we also switched lenses. So what we did is we used a sort of our base package was a set of Summicrons, Leica Summicrons, and that's a T2 lens, and they're fairly sharp, but they also have a sort of creamy quality to them, as Leicas tend to do.
Yeah.
But really, the workhorses for this season, the lenses we tended to use the most, especially on day exteriors, are a set of Leica Rs, which are vintage, still lenses that have been rehoused to use on a cinema camera and a digital cinema camera.
Nice.
And a Noctilux 50 millimeter, which is a T1 lens, which is an incredibly hard thing to pull focus on. But that being said, I rarely shot it at a T1. It was most of the time around a 1.4, where it resolves a bit better, for film, and matches a little bit better. But essentially, like, the workhorses of this season were vintage Leicas.
And I see a lot of you're employing a lot of wide shots in this season. It has a bigger feel, obviously with the new camera format and the large format in the Venice. But I think overall, things feel wider to me. They feel like you're even taking wider lenses and going close up to people's faces. Was that a conscious decision, or have you just been doing that all the time, but the new camera is giving us a different feel?
Yeah, so actually we've been doing that the whole time, but the beauty of the bigger format is that it brings the character forward in the lens. There's something about that bigger sensor that just sort of sucks the character a little bit forward in the image and creates a little more separation from the background, aside from the decreased depth of field, that there is just sort of this presence that characters have on screen. And I mean, if you look at these old like VistaVision movies and these old, 8-perf movies that were shot on film, the characters are so present on it, and it really just brings the character forward into your living room. And so I think that there's something with the larger format. It definitely makes every lens a little bit wider, but primarily we're still using, the only lenses we really use on Ozark for 99% of it are this season were a 35, a 50, and an 80. Wow. Like, those are primarily the lenses. And then, there is a bunch of wide shots that we're doing, but, essentially like a 35 millimeter lens on a full format camera is the same size as like a 25 on Super 35. So all your lenses get a little bit wider by putting them on a full frame camera. And I think there has been an effort to, on Ozark, give scope. And I'm a huge believer in that. Like, I'm always pushing for that, like, insanely wide shot where the characters are tiny, and then you can cut into, a medium close-up. We're dealing with people watching on their iPads and watching on their computers and watching on smaller and smaller devices on their phones. So you do need to shoot on you do need to be shooting sizes on characters where it's relatable, where I can see the expression on their face. But to sort of counteract that, we've always prioritized doing wide shots. That doesn't mean we do the wide shots. It doesn't mean that we always make an attempt to do some big graphic wide that shows scope and shows environment. I think from the beginning, Ozark has been such a show about environment and place, and that felt so important from the beginning. And we don't want to lose that. We don't want to turn it into a melodrama of talking heads. And I think a lot of that comes back to environment and place, and really putting actors in real time and real place, small out on a big lake, me in their house looking at them through the windows, all of those sort of shots, I think really help tell that story.
Well, it's a fantastic season. It looks amazing. Of course, I didn't expect anything less, but I really think you guys delivered this time around for sure. It's just so good. It's so, so good. And I can't wait to finish it. I got 4 more left, but I've seen all of yours. That's the important part. Thank you so much for being on, Ben. Of course, you guys check out his Instagram, Ben Kutchins, Kutchins on Instagram, his website, benkutchins.com. And of course, we're going to be doing an Instagram Live tonight, although this episode's coming after the Instagram Live. So the timing is kind of a little bit wonky, but we're going to also be doing an Instagram Live, and we will be putting that on our YouTube page. So for those of you guys listening now that don't get to see the Instagram Live, it will also be on YouTube for you guys to enjoy afterwards. So Ben, thank you so much for being on Go Creative Show. And you mentioned that you had to leave the set to go shoot a film. So I'm hoping you come back to talk about your film when it's ready.
I'd love to do that. Thank you so much for this, man. I really appreciate it.
So I want to thank Ben Kutchins for coming on the show today and talking about his work on Ozark. I absolutely love the show, and I know you guys did too, because we got a lot of response on our social media. And I want to encourage you, follow us on social media. You get an opportunity to have your questions heard on the show. And, our audience is very smart, and their questions are fantastic. So I want more of that. So follow us there and get involved. I also want to thank Matt Russell for mixing and mastering and making the show sound so good. You can find him over at gainstructure.com, and on Twitter at gainstructure. And of course, our producer, Connor Crosby, for putting the whole show together behind the scenes. You can find him at ignitionvisuals.com. Now, don't forget, follow me for upcoming Instagram Lives at Ben Consoli. And of course, our website, gocreativeshow.com. That's where you find everything related to Go Creative Show, a one-stop shop. Especially now, people are looking for content, and wow, we've got a lot of content there. So head over there and learn. You know where else you can learn? MZ.com, our great sponsor, MZ, Education for Filmmakers. Please support MZ, because without them, without our sponsors, the show doesn't exist. So support those that support us, and we'll see you next week on another episode of Go Creative Show.